Hi ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kenneth and I'm a fat boy that likes McGriddles this week. Today we're going to talk about FiR audio. FiR Audio is held by Bogdan Balanoshko, no stranger to the IEM industry. In fact, he actually helped another rather popular custom IEM company before setting up FiR Audio. Today we're going to take a look in their M series lineup. Looking at the script, I realized that, today is gonna be quite a long video, so I think it's better for us to divide this episode into two parts. So right now we're gonna start off with the first part with the M3 and M4 before moving on to the second part where we talk about the M5 and the various comparisons between each model. So the first earphone in the FiR Audio lineup would be the M3. Now the M3 is a hybrid design whereby it has one dynamic driver that features FiR Audio's tactile bass that uses the whole chassis as a bass transducer, and it's paired to two other balanced armature. And on top of that, it has its Atom module, which is a pressure relief system that makes wearing this earphone extremely comfortable. And now let's find out a bit more about the sound of this earphone. Now the M3 is actually a V-shaped sounding earphone whereby it actually has accentuated bass and accentuated highs. Now this makes the earphone perfect for rock or metal music whereby you can actually benefit from the additional bass, and the highs make the guitar sounds a bit crunchier, and it sounds really compact in that way, and it's really accentuates the sort of music that it plays. Bass on the M3 is actually a rumbly affair. It is considerably rumblier than the M4 and M5, and this actually plays to its strength, being perfectly suited for rock or metal music. So with this kind of rumbly bass, it actually lends its tone to the guitars, making each chord sounds chunkier, and this really accentuates the type of music. Now we talk about mids. Remember earlier on I said that the M3 actually V-shaped sounding? It has elevated highs and elevated bass, while the mids are actually a bit recessed. Does this recess actually mean that it gets lost out in the mix? For the M3, it doesn't mean that at all. In fact, it has very good separation compared to the other two frequencies, whereby you can actually hear vocals rather clearly, albeit a little bit softer compared to the bass and highs. Now, for mids, there are technically two major segregations. So the first of which is female vocals. For the M3, female vocals sound very delicate and sweet, and it's actually very dynamic. So if you have a singer that belts out lovely vocal solos, you can actually feel the dynamics very well. But for male vocals, on the other hand, it is a bit different. It is actually a bit less dynamic, but that's not essentially a bad thing. So a lot of rock singers actually use this recording style to make it a bit less dynamic. And now we're going to talk about treble. So the treble on the M3 is a little bit elevated compared to the mid-range. It being elevated doesn't mean that it sounds harsh or too loud or any of that. It just means that the treble frequencies are very, very clear and very, very pristine. It is actually very crisp. If you're listening to your hi-hat, they actually have a very nice crisp tone on it. And if you listen to the crashes, when you hit the crash, it has that shimmering type of sound. Is also actually very clear. And with the treble frequencies that I get with the M3, it actually lends its character to the airiness of the whole sound signature. The airiness is not only due to the treble frequencies, but it's also due to the Atom module, which is a pressure relieving system, lending it to have a larger soundstage than you would otherwise perceive. And now we come to soundstage. For the M3, because of its V-shaped tuning, it has a very interesting soundstage. The M3 actually sounds pretty wide. It is not particularly tall. In terms of positioning, it actually positions the instrument rather well. You can actually tell where the instruments are coming from. But one thing I find the M3 to be slightly lacking would be the depth perception. Also because of its frequency response, whereby you get a bit more bass, you don't actually get the perception of how deep the instruments. But on the whole, it is actually a very, well, I would say good soundstage, but it's just not the absolute best if you would like to have pinpoint precision in terms of soundstage. So now moving on to the M4. Now the M4 and M3 are completely different beasts. In fact, the M4 is more likened to the M5. With the M3, it sounds V-shaped. The M4 on the other hand, it's a little bit more balanced. It still has a slightly elevated bass and treble response, but not to the extent of the M3. The M4 actually has some of FiR Audio's proprietary technologies, including tactile bass, which is featured in its dynamic driver, and 3 more balanced armatures to pair with it. One of it is the direct treble balance armature. And with that, let's find out more about the M4 sound signature. Talking about the bass of the M4. Now, the bass of the M4 is completely not like the M3, where the M3 was rumbly, the M4 is tight and fast. Instead of it just purely being tight and fast, there's actually some resonance to it, which is very different from how the M3 portrays bass. It's like one very tight hit, and you hear the echoes around it, if that makes sense. This is the bass of the M4. Now, with the mids of the M4, it serves as a very good point in the FiR Audio M series lineup. It has world-class separation, whereby it's separated from the background extremely well, actually better than the M3. The M4 mid-range is both equally well in female vocals and in male vocals. It doesn't have a particular coloration, but it sounds really sweet, and it is also very dynamic. It can show power and can show the delicate emotions in female vocals. For men, on the other hand, if someone sings a really powerful solo, it can scale together with how the singer sings. And overall, I think vocals for the M4 is done very well. In fact, it's more well-rounded compared to the M3. With regards to the treble for the M4 on the whole has a very focused kind of tonality, which is very different from the M3, which actually contrasts to the airiness of it. So whenever something high frequency is being played, you actually get a very grand sense of air because the high frequencies are focused, but there is also the airiness to it, so there's a very big contrast, which I think is lovely on the M4. And it is also very clear, you still get the very concise hi-hat sounds, your cymbals crashing. They all sound very crisp and very sweet. In fact, it's a bit crisper than the M3. Now, adding on, the M4's treble is actually very well controlled. In fact, it's so well controlled that it doesn't actually try to overthrow the mid-range or overthrow the bass frequencies and being just all treble. It actually blends together very well with the mid-range, making it a very balanced listen. Now we're going to talk about soundstage for the M4. Now, soundstage on the M4 is completely different from the M3. M4 has, well, very good depth because of how balanced it is. You can actually tell instruments being forward or backward. So you can hear this separation, this layering gradations a lot better. In terms of width, well, the M4 actually sounds just as wide as the M3, which is excellent. Height-wise, it actually sounds a bit taller as well. And in terms of positioning, because of its signature whereby it's balanced, you get better positioning as bass tends to hide positioning, but because it's balanced, you can actually pinpoint where the instruments are coming from, which is very interesting. In fact, actually, you know, if you like this kind of thing, you can try the virtual haircut that is on YouTube. It's quite an experience with the M4 and even the M5. Before we end off this video, I would like to compare the M3 and M4 just a little bit, right? Now, fundamentally, the M3 and M4s are very different earphones. The M3 is V-shaped, while the M4 is a bit more balanced. Now, with the M3, it works perfectly well for rock. It is, you know, well, basically there is more bass and there's more highs. It makes compressed music sound a lot more interesting. The M4, on the other hand, it's more balanced sounding. It basically just works well with most genres, if not all, and vocals on the M4 really is a very sweet experience. For me to decide which is better, to be honest with you, I can't. So my suggestion is this: if you only listen to rock and metal, you know what? Go with the M3 and it will serve you well. If you listen to all sorts of genres, then maybe the M4 will be a better choice because it can just essentially do everything really well. And with that, this is the end of the video for the M series comparison. Stay tuned next week for the M5 and the comparisons between the M3 and M4. And with that, please like and subscribe, and please click the bell icon if you want to be notified. Please. But you know, thanks for watching. See you next week.
The virtual haircut is a super classic one, right?
Yeah,
like
it is nice. It is 9 years ago. It's still an excellent binaural recording. So if I feel like having a haircut and I don't feel like actually doing a real haircut, I just listen to Bubble, that virtual haircut thing. It's quite fun.